Welcome to the post-pandemic occupational licensing reformed webinar. My name is Ross Emmett, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty at Arizona State University. Today's event is the second of this year's Perspectives on Economic Liberty webinars, sponsored by the Center. The Center is part of ASU's School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, as well as the W.P. Carey School of Business, and has the mission of evaluating the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. Since its inception, the Center has contributed to the discussion of both the impact of occupational licensing on specific groups and of potential reforms. Today, I am happy to welcome Professor Morris Kleiner and the Center's own Steve Slavinsky to assist us in thinking about occupational licensing reforms in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me introduce the speakers briefly. Morris Kleiner is Professor of Labor Policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and teaches at the Center for Human Resources and Labor Studies, both at the University of Minnesota. He has received more awards for his teaching and research and spoken to more government commissions, state legislatures, and TV shows than I can possibly list and still give you time to hear him talk. But I will say that his recent noteworthy books have emerged from his collaboration with other scholars at the very fine Upjohn Institute for Employment Research in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and that next year we'll see the release of another book from that collaboration, which is a multinational comparison of occupational licensing regimes and the quality of services provided. Professor Kleiner is joined by Steve Slavinsky, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty at ASU, and also the Project Director for Doing Business North America. The newest DBNA report, released within the next month, will provide objective measures of the ease of doing business in 130 cities across the 92 states, provinces, and federal districts of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Before I turn things over to Morris, a word about our format. Morris will speak for 20 minutes, and Steve will then speak for 10. If you wish to ask a question, please enter the question in the Q&A feature that you can see at the bottom of the Zoom window. Do not use the chat function to submit questions. The questions that are submitted to the Q&A feature will be collected and will be forwarded to me to ask Morris and Steve. After 20 minutes of Q&A, we'll have a final wrap up, and I will close at the end of the hour with an announcement about upcoming events. Morris, we're delighted to have you with us, and I'll turn things over to you now.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. I think my father would have been very proud, and my mother would have probably even believed it. So thank you very much. Just as a quick background, I started to become interested in occupational licensing when I was in Washington, D.C. I was working at the Brookings Institution and was assigned to the Department of Labor. And my boss at the time called me in and said, well, you're going to be working on occupational licensing. And I thought, well, I probably got this terrible assignment because I'm the new person on the block. But it turned out to be a very exciting and fruitful and interesting issue. And as a result, I became more familiar with the work of Milton Friedman, who really was the founder of a lot of the research in this area. He had a chapter on capitalism and freedom, dealing with occupational licensing, and is a fairly famous TV show on public television called Free to Choose, also focused on issues of occupational regulation and licensing. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of different issues. As I mentioned, I spent some time at the Brookings Institution, and Arthur Okun, who was one of the luminaries at the time at Brookings, developed a book. In fact, even to this day, that book is the best-selling Brookings book of all time, and it's called Equity and Efficiency, the Great Trade-Off. And I think one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on are some of the trade-offs, some of the costs and benefits of occupational licensing, and then relating that to our current situation in the post-pandemic situation. So I'm going to hopefully focus on this, and hopefully you can see the screen, full screen. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the center. I will be sort of going through a number of slides as part of this. Hopefully you can see the first one. As part of this, we'll be focusing on a number of empirical pieces that have provided, let's see, hopefully now you can. So the avenues to the post-pandemic prosperity. And what I'm going to be focusing on is occupational licensing in the labor market, and really focusing on issues of efficiency in the age of COVID, and then provide some background on some of the changes that have occurred as a result of the pandemic. But I'm going to start with what is occupational licensing. Certainly many of you are very familiar, but I'm sure there are individuals who are not as familiar. So I thought I would start with sort of 101 in terms of occupational licensing, and try to answer a question of, is occupational grease or sand in labor market efficiency? That is, does licensing make the labor market more efficient by providing lots of opportunities and benefits, or is it sand and sort of gumming up the works in terms of what's happening in the labor market? And then use some of the results to try to understand, has the COVID pandemic changed how we see licensing? So those are the three areas that I want to cover in my relatively short time period. And I really enjoy questions, so I'm looking forward to fielding those as well. I'm sure Steve does as well. So wanted to start out, I'm a college professor, and I always like to focus on some of the first order issues. What is occupational licensing? So I'll start with what I call occupational licensing 101. So occupational licensing is a credential awarded by a government agency that constitutes a legal authority to do a specific job. And if you don't have that credential, or if you haven't met those requirements, the government can use the police powers of the state to put you out of business. Now, there are various other forms of regulation. Certainly, there's the market force, there's certification, there's registration, and many other ways to provide consumers with information on how qualified an individual might be to perform a particular task. So just to define this, so government regulators require practitioners to obtain a license to work in many occupations. So it's really the ability, or legally required or related to work for pay. And usually workers obtain a license by satisfying minimum human capital requirements, such as education and exams. And over time, those requirements tend to ratchet themselves up. So a number of years ago, in order to become a physical therapist, you could become licensed with a junior college degree. And now in most all states, you need to be a doctor of physical therapy in order to be licensed in that occupation. Lawyers in the US are licensed. That's another example, by attending an approved law school and generally passing examinations. So generally there's education requirements, exams, sometimes internships, depending on the type of occupation and the industry that individuals are working in. Now, occupational licensing has grown dramatically. So in this figure, showing both unionization and licensing over time. And in the 1950s, licensing was between 4 to 5% of the US workforce. Unionization, on the other hand, in the 1950s was over 35% of workers belonged to a union. And that has sort of flipped, not completely, but licensing is somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 workers must have permission from government in order to work, but that doesn't include individuals who may be influenced by licensing. So for example, there's licensing in architecture. Although relatively few architects obtain a license, or in accounting, where less than half of accountants are CPAs, but they're influenced in terms of their ability to do certain tasks. So even though only 1 in 4, 1 in 5 workers say on the current population survey that they themselves have a license, licensing is much more pervasive in that licensing coverage is much greater than the 20 to 25% of all workers who obtain a license. So what effect does licensing have in terms of the labor market? Is it this grease or is it sand? Well, licensing has had an effect on the ability of people to switch occupations. Alex de Tocqueville, writing about the United States in the 1830s, noted that people were able to switch occupations fairly easily, going from a doctor to a farmer to a preacher to doing many different occupations. Well, more recently, the ability to switch occupations has become much more difficult. As licensing by the red line suggests it's increased, occupational licensing, or the ability to switch occupations, has declined. And the effect of occupational licensing on entering or leaving licensed occupations is much more dramatic. So over occupation, between occupations is due to occupational licensing. So people who enter a licensed occupation, it's very difficult to do that, but it's also very difficult to leave. In fact, this might be viewed as, for those of you who are old rock and roll fans, the Eagles, arguably their most famous song, Hotel California, once you enter, you never leave. Well, that's also true in terms of occupational licensing. Once someone enters in a licensed occupation, they rarely leave. And it has had this large effect on reducing the ability of people in the United States to change occupations, which creates a barrier to entry. If you started out in occupation A, you're a programmer, you want to become an accountant, you have to go back to school for a long period of time, which reduces mobility. And these are requirements by the government. Also, occupational licensing has had some very significant effects on interstate migration. So this is some data, and there was a break in the government data, which suggests the break in the figure. So gross migration rates starting in the 1970s started to decline just as occupational licensing was expanding. And the reason for this, it's not terribly surprising to note that as you're moving across state lines and you are in a licensed occupation, it's much more difficult. If you're a teacher and you want to move from California to Minnesota, you have to go back for a year and a half or two to go to a state teachers college to pick up additional education credits. Even in one case, someone who was taught physics in California, came to Minnesota, wanted to be a math teacher, and had to go back to school for a year and a half or two, which greatly diminishes the likelihood of individuals crossing state lines in order to take advantage of economic opportunity. So it is much more, it's much more difficult. And of course, if you are teaching math in California, California math is obviously very different than Minnesota math. Of course, those are some of the issues for teachers, for pharmacists, for many different occupations. The ability to move across state lines is very difficult. Well, when you add all this up, which we did, I did in a paper with Evan Soltis, who is my co-author, who's at MIT, we sort of put this all together using some data from the current population survey. And we found that hourly wages for licensed occupations were about 15% higher than those not in licensed, who are not in licensed occupations. Individuals, given the higher wages, they work a little bit more, about 3% more, about 1.4 hours per week more than individuals in non-licensed occupations. However, licensing, and not surprisingly, serves as a very significant barrier to employment. And those states that had the highest licensing rates measured by occupations in that state being licensed, the number of workers in that state that were licensed in that occupation, employment went down by 29%. And my colleague Peter Blair, who looked at some different data, came up, a colleague who's at Harvard, we both work on occupational licensing, but looked at a very different database. We used the CPS, found very similar results. So when you add all this up and what's called the deadweight loss, the net loss of occupational surplus is about 12%. So the loss to the economy of occupational licensing is about 12%. So it really, in terms of trying to answer that question, is it grease or is it sand? It seems to throw a lot of sand into the machinery of the labor market. So in terms of efficiency, which my former colleague Arthur Okun would say that it seems to reduce efficiency. But what effect, since the theme of our presentation and the theme of our discussion is on what effect it has on COVID. Well, one of the things that COVID has done is to relax the occupational licensing across states. So now 25 states are allowing licensed healthcare practitioners to provide healthcare services without completing new licensing requirements. So they're able to go to previous licensing requirements in order to work. Laws allowing licensed out-of-state healthcare practitioners to practice in a state have been changed by 35 states. And this is since February 2020. So there's been a very dramatic shift in allowing individuals to reduce many of these barriers, either entering an occupation or moving across state lines to accept a new occupation. In addition, 10 states have allowed for immediate temporary occupational licenses to current or previous students. So if you let your license lapse, you can come back and practice without having to retake the licensing exam or reapplying to become licensed. And students who graduated from programs such as respiratory therapy, which are directly related to COVID, or nurse practitioners, were allowed to immediately practice even though they hadn't fulfilled all the requirements like taking the test. And retired nurse practitioners or respiratory therapists were able to enter the market without reapplying for licensing. Now, a couple of things. Colorado has some very good data. And the reason I've been sort of focused on Colorado is they have some really, their policy analysts are among the best, and they provide lots of data to look at this. But they've also had a couple of really interesting experiments. They've allowed telehealth for the first time in 2020. They've allowed mental health practitioners to practice, and allows veterinary telemedicine without an existent client relationship. It authorized also emergency rules or temporary licenses for many different occupations that allowed them to practice right away. Also, there's been a real response. So when these licenses were relaxed, there was an increase of the number of advanced nurse practitioners, physicians, nurse assistants. These are all individuals who came back and were working in these occupations, even though prior to the pandemic, they would not have been allowed to work in the state of Colorado. So in May, the state issued rules, and as of May, about 20 nurses have been issued temporary licenses, and these are individuals who had not met the requirements but were allowed to work as a consequence of the changes in the law. So in Colorado, there's been the ability to add to labor supply and add to health capacity as a result of relaxing these occupational licensing restrictions. So what are the implications for licensing policy? I'll conclude, is licensing usually serves as sand in the efficient operations of the labor market, and may well serve as a barrier for low-income individuals who don't have the assets. There's a reduction in licensing barriers that has served in many states, and especially in Colorado, to increase labor supply and increase healthcare capacity. The question that hopefully we'll maybe be able to answer later on is, will these licensing barriers return following the pandemic? And I think that's the $64 question. And with that, I've exhausted my time and want to make sure that I give Steve plenty of time to talk about these issues.
Well, Morris, thanks so much for joining us today. A lot of us in this field think of Dr. Kleiner as sort of the godfather. And so we're so happy to have him with us today to chat about these issues. I also want to provide my origin story, since Dr. Kleiner mentioned it too. His origin story, in a sense, I started out in public finance economics. I was doing tax and budget policy. But I began to realize that tax and budget policy are important to influencing economic outcomes, but if you don't have a job, you're not paying taxes. And if you don't have a job, it might be because there are certain regulatory barriers that are standing in your way. And so that's when I began to notice there's some interesting opportunities to think about broader trends in terms of economic liberty, certainly, when it comes to applications using occupational licensing as the example. I'm going to go ahead and show you my slides right now because I want to walk us back in history. It might be hard to remember a time before the pandemic. It does seem like a faraway land in some respects, but I think to think about the future of occupational licensing reform, we probably need to think a little bit about how we got here in the first place. And Dr. Kleiner mentioned a little bit about it because the truth is we've been talking about this issue, economists and researchers, for quite a while, even going back to Milton Friedman. And so what you might consider sort of a consensus on pre-pandemic licensing reform, the forays that we were tending to see were direct, in a sense, reforms and removals or reductions in these barriers to entry for specific professions. These types of barriers or these types of limits that we were putting on people were typically requirements, if you will, as Dr. Kleiner put it. For licenses to be received, you had to go through a series of hours. They vary by state, incidentally, and so there's not one consistent pattern. You see lots of states doing different things, different fee structures, different sometimes requirements for certain types of diplomas to actually apply for a license. But so the forays into reforming them were generally in the form of going after those specific barriers, lowering those fees, lowering those training requirements. And we saw this momentum occurring in a lot of those ways, but it was hit or miss sometimes, depending upon what I would argue would maybe be the lobbying clout of whatever incumbent license holders there were in a state. So one idea that began to come on the scene, and again, this is actually going back decades, even back perhaps as far as Milton Friedman and Dr. Kleiner has also written about this, and I have too, is something called universal licensing, universal licensing reciprocity is a term you often hear. And that began to gain momentum. And what that means is simply this. As Dr. Kleiner identified this mobility issue, people either switching professions or more accurately, in this specific case, going to another state. And what they were doing is, of course, going over the state line and having to go through all of those multiple hundreds of hours and fees required to get a new license in the new state, even though their experience level and their competency had not changed at all. So the idea of licensing reciprocity was a reform that you can actively pursue and act in your state that would say, if you have a license of good standing from a state where you used to live and you're coming into ours, we will give you a comparable license here in the state that you just moved to. And this began to gain momentum. I'm proud to say, first one of these of its type were signed into law in Arizona in 2019. But you began to see a little bit of momentum early on. In fact, 2019 is when it was signed into law. It took an effect later that year. And a few other states began to start looking at that into 2020, and then the pandemic hit. So where we're at now is what I consider to be the current pandemic reform activity. And as Dr. Kleiner mentioned, many states, actually I counted over a dozen, but he counted many more because he was going very broad in the primary medical fields. Just the idea that we were beginning to see governors and state legislatures, but mostly governors, and I'll talk about that in a moment, noticing that these barriers were actually counterproductive in trying to get doctors to the front lines, healthcare professionals fighting COVID-19. And so they began to temporarily suspend a whole number of the types of laws that you see in licensing laws. Now, a lot of those tended to embrace some form of this licensing reciprocity that I talked about before. The idea that a healthcare worker can come from another state and then come into your home state and basically have the capability, legal jurisdiction to actually practice in that state. And of course, this does implicitly at least effectively show people that these barriers might have actually been counterproductive even in a period without a pandemic virus to fight. But of course, in an emergency situation, you began to see these barriers come down, and for a good reason, because they were actually helping unlock a lot of human capital, a lot of potential to get healthcare workers to the front lines. Some of these were temporary expansions in the scope of practice. As Dr. Kleiner also mentioned, you can have nurse practitioners who might not be able to do as many things as they do under a lot of these emergency provisions. They are able to do now in a lot of states because, again, of the need to have healthcare workers. But what's interesting in all of these, and I've used the phrase temporary a couple times, both in my slides and mentioning it verbally, is that these were mainly put into place through executive orders or emergency orders. They have expiration dates. They will at some point lapse, perhaps soon. So the question would be, what happens after this? What happens in the post-pandemic era, which I hope we'll be in soon? But as a policy and a practical matter, we need to be thinking about what did we learn by taking down these barriers? We actually found people moving to where they were most needed. And we also found within occupations and also between states, but we also found more potential to allow more people to fulfill these jobs. And so I think these temporary expansions may have the potential to set the stage for a longer term, permanent, or more permanent anyway than temporary, reform of these licensing laws. Now, as luck would have it, there were actually a couple of legislative actions and governor signatures that became law in the realm of permanent changes in licensing laws. Now, as I mentioned before, and as we all probably saw in our states, and if you're out of state, of course, you probably saw this in your state as well, it was just sort of the cessation, or I should say the stopping of normal course of business type of stuff in state legislatures. And so a lot of legislative stuff came to a halt, but there's a few places that did some sessions and had some stuff in the hopper. They were able to get over the finish line. And one of those was an idea of this, again, bringing back this reciprocity idea, the idea that we can allow people to come into a state and have a reciprocal license that mimics what they had in their home state. And we actually saw 2 permanent changes to licensing laws, of this form in Missouri and Iowa over the summer, June and July. What's especially significant about this is because, and there were others, by the way, but these are the 2 that I found most significant. And the main reason I found the most significant, in particular the Iowa one, is because it actually goes further than just saying if you have a license in good standing in the state that you've come from, we'll give you a license. It also says, maybe you're coming from a state that didn't license your occupation, and we here in Iowa, we do license the occupation. But guess what? As long as you've got 3 years of reliable work experience and you can prove competency, we will give you a license for the state of Iowa. So this actually opens up a much broader range of opportunities for people to move into the state of Iowa than other states that have reciprocity laws, including Arizona, would allow. So I think Iowa is actually setting the stage, and I think planting the seeds for a much more robust form of licensing and universal licensing reform than we've seen in the past. And that occurred during a period of the pandemic. So again, I think this is teeing up the ball for, I think, future reforms. And I think it would really have to, because we're seeing some changes in the workforce that we never really expected to see. In some sense, you might say that we were sort of pushed into doing something, a set of things quicker in a way that we didn't expect. And so what I think of as being the reality of the post-pandemic reform opportunities is the fact that there's going to be more remote work in a mobile workforce. These are people moving across state lines to look for new work, or it could be people moving across state lines and maintaining their current job. And of course, moving into another state, you're going to have a license in some of these things. And so if you're licensed in one state, there's no need to have to re-up your license, if you will, in the new state. It's especially remarkable when you think about the mobility and the remote work arrangements we're seeing in places, say, like Silicon Valley, a place where you normally people will all congregate, and yet it's a very expensive place to live. And once Facebook, Google, and companies like this in Silicon Valley gave workers the opportunity to work indefinitely from home, many of them left San Francisco. In fact, some of the new studies that are coming out indicate that rents are dropping in San Francisco for the first time in decades. People are moving to Las Vegas, to Phoenix, to Austin and Houston, to Raleigh, North Carolina, places that have a lower cost of living, and yet they can still do their work. Now, granted, software engineers don't need licenses to do their job, but construction workers might need to do licensing between states. And that's why population migration is going to be something to keep an eye on. Because even if you are in your state and you want to change your occupation, like Dr. Kleiner mentioned, it happens less often now than it did just in decades past. And so the idea of being able to reform licensing laws and make them more amenable to people working within a state to change their occupation is an extremely important goal. But what about people who want to move? And population migration is something we're going to be seeing probably a lot more of, because the reality is that the pandemic has not influenced each economy in the same way. Different places are going to react and respond and recover more slowly than others, or some will recover more quickly than others. And so people wanting to relocate, to look for new opportunities, this is exactly the kind of barrier that licensing will put up that actually makes it difficult to have these population migrations. And so as we see a more mobile workforce, having this ability for states to open their licensing laws and reap the gains of a more mobile workforce, and even a younger workforce, with demographic realities being what they are. This is an important thing for state legislators to be thinking about, not just after the pandemic, but of course, just the broad idea that licensing are barriers that we really can't afford a lot of the time. And so that's something that I think will not lessen in terms of our thinking when we go forward once the pandemic is over. So again, Dr. Kleiner, thanks for being with us today, and thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to be taking questions from the audience through the Q&A. So if you have more questions, you can address there. And one question has been asked a couple times, and so I'm going to advance that question over the one that I was going to originally start with, because that was my own question. So I'll give this a broader place. This is for either of you, both Morris and Steve. There's a concern that one of the reasons we have licensing is because we wish to protect life and safety and the welfare of the public. and that's the foremost concern in setting licensing arrangements. How do you fulfill those central aspects of licensing requirements and the purpose of licensing requirements if we relax licensing requirements or undertake other kinds of arrangements for ensuring that people are qualified to do the jobs they're doing?
Well, I can start out, and I'll have Steve carry on. I'll pass the baton to him, but certainly at a group like this, you have market forces. You buy cars from generally in most states from unlicensed salespeople. People send their kids and spend $60,000 a year to go to Harvard or to MIT, and virtually none of the faculty at either one of those institutions have a license. Certainly in terms of health and safety, one can have a license, or there are other forms that are less restrictive. Obviously the market, there's bonding that can take place. You post a bond. If someone doesn't do a good job, you can sue them. In terms of entering an occupation, you post a bond. If you do a terrible job, you can be sued and be put out of business, or your insurance costs are very high. There's registration, the sort of thing you have with Angie's List. In order to get on a government list, you have to show that you're qualified. There's certification, which is a right to title, that only a chartered financial analyst can use that title. If someone else uses that title and you haven't met those requirements, you can be sued for fraud. And then only, and this is a model that was developed by the Institute for Justice, only at the tip of the spear, only the smallest amount perhaps should be licensed, where individuals have to have permission from government and to use the police powers of the state to stop them from doing their work. And again, I'm not saying every occupation should be deregulated, but each occupation should be evaluated on its costs and benefits.
And yeah, and I'd like to also mention, in fact, this is actually stemming in large part from Dr. Kleiner's work as well on the subject. There's actually not a lot of connection between licensing levels or just the appearance of licensing and actual quality, health, and safety outcomes. And so the argument is often that among licensing supporters that if we didn't have these licenses, we actually wouldn't have quality, reputable service providers. And the truth is, in places where you license some occupations and you don't license them in other states, and you compare the types of health and safety outcomes, there's really no statistically significant difference between the states that license and the states that don't license. I think that's largely because of the types of private sector, other types of levers that are in place, liability rules and things of this sort. But the truth of it is licensing is not actually the most impactful, well, I shouldn't say it's the most cost-effective way of achieving these ends. And in fact, if anything, as we've seen, it's probably the most economically costly.
I think that if the message I've taken away from both hearing Professor Kleiner before and listening to Steve is that we want varieties of possible various ways of thinking about ensuring that we protect life, safety, and the general welfare, and across different occupations. Those are ones that we need to think about, and that there's no necessarily one size fits all. I'm wondering in that light, Steve, you made a comment, and maybe Morris can kick in after Steve does. The argument for universal licensing reciprocity. For those who do care about licensing reform, would it lead us to get kind of stuck in place? Because if people were moving to states that they wanted to move to and were able to get this reciprocal license, then would we actually would any states have a need to reform?
So it's funny, actually, you asked that question because that was actually a question I asked myself when I first heard of the idea. And I was skeptical at first, but I began to think about the procedural realities of licensing. And I began to realize that you've got multiple levels. It's rather complex if you think about it. You've got the political economy of how these rules are made. You've got the legislative level, which says at the state level, we're going to mandate a certain, first of all, mandate the license at all. And then you're mandating the number of hours and fees and such. But then enforcing those laws are occupational licensing boards in the states. And many state laws are vague enough that the licensing boards actually have a great deal of power to arbitrarily and sometimes capriciously enforce these vague standards or do so in a differential way. So if you come into it with the assumption, and most economists make this assumption, and I do too, that licensing boards by definition are really trying to, in some respects, minimize competition. So they're going to try to keep more people out than they let in. So if you make that assumption, and economists would, generally speaking, begin to realize that the sticking point in a lot of reform efforts is the licensing board. So what licensing reciprocity does is, in a sense, I would say, sort of make an end run around the licensing board. Because basically what it does is it says, if you've got a license in good standing from another place, we'll just rubber stamp you as a legal matter, and you have got a license in our state as well. The reason I brought up the Iowa example is especially compelling, because in a world in which you have reciprocity between states, that it does sound like it might have just sort of locks us in stasis, but all it takes is one or a handful of states to say, you don't even need a license from your state of origin, as long as you've got 3 years of work experience, or maybe a certification from a private certifier or a good housekeeping seal of approval from a nationally accredited agency of some sort. That serves as a proxy license. We'll let you do that too. And so now you're seeing more of a competitive licensing scheme than one that we're seeing currently. So that's the main reason why I was a convert to the idea of what we're calling reciprocity. But the phrase I like to use a lot more is universal licensing, because that, in a sense, is what we're talking about. We're talking about competing credentials that all have the same kind of weight of law.
Professor Kleiner, do you have?
Yeah, I would just add that that the ability to move across state lines is very important. It allows competition among the states. Certainly Arizona has been the leader, and Steve mentioned a number of states are following that lead and allowing people to come to Arizona. If they're a resident, their license is recognized. So I think all these are very important for the issue of labor market fluidity and efficiency, and it will, in the long run, reduce employment by allowing people to go where they're most productive, and it will enhance their earnings by being able to go to where they're most productive and where people are willing to hire them without these potentially artificial barriers.
Thank you. There's been another question asked. Are there any jurisdictions that only require a license if you charge for the service being provided?
Well, I would say in general that's the definition of licensing, that if you're charging for the service and you haven't met the state requirements, then you are in violation of the law. You can have your brother-in-law do the plumbing or do the electrical work if they're doing it for free, but if they're charging for it, then there's a real problem. In fact, there was an interesting situation in the state of Florida where they set up a sting operation where they invited in handymen or handy women who were asked to bid on different construction projects. And then the individual asked them, this was non-licensed work, then they said, well, can you fix this toilet while you're here? And if they said, well, if I'm here, I can do it. And then they were arrested and or fined. So these are sting operations that happen, that states do, largely at the impetus of the building trades or other organizations to make sure that unregulated workers aren't doing the work of licensed practitioners.
I was just scanning my questions here. So I was interested in Steve's comments and Morris's comments as well about migration potentially happening here as a result of COVID or in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. So suppose someone from Silicon Valley who is licensed in San Francisco, California, leaves San Francisco and moves to Raleigh, North Carolina, and continues to do the work that they're doing for the company in San Francisco. Are they, do they need to be licensed in North Carolina? They now live in North Carolina, but let's say 100% of their work is being done on behalf of, a company in San Francisco Bay Area, and it's work that they are licensed for. But would they need to get licensed where they live or not?
I know.
Morris mentioned, I think it depends on the profession, I'm assuming, right? Telemedicine is probably a good example where you've got.
I was thinking about the ones that would. Yeah.
Right. So, but Dr. Kleiner, I think you probably have a more robust answer than I do on that one.
Well, I certainly there are a number of states, including the state that I mentioned in my talk. Colorado has really relaxed the restrictions. Most states during the pandemic, and this is what economists call an exogenous shock to the system. You have, especially in healthcare, a need for increased capacity and the ability to provide these services. So the question is, can you do it across state lines? And that has yet to be settled. There are a couple of cases that the Institute for Justice, and those cases are winding their way through the courts. It started out with veterinary medicine, an individual who was providing veterinary services via telemedicine across state lines. The Veterinary Association sued this person, saying that at least where they were providing these services, they were not licensed in that state. They tried to put that person out of business, and that is currently winding its way through the courts. And just one major case, which deals with some of the issues that Steve mentioned, was North Carolina Dental versus the Federal Trade Commission, where licensing boards who had to be practitioners of dentistry tried to put people who were selling tooth whitening kits out of business. They were selling these kits in spas and malls, and the Federal Trade Commission sued the North Carolina Dental Association, saying they were in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court said that everyone on the committee, on the board, had to be a practicing dentist. Certainly the Federal Trade Commission saw there was a conflict of interest, and the Supreme Court said that these boards had to be monitored by the sovereign being the state. So that's led to some very significant changes in the composition of the boards, as well as people who might want to serve on the board, because under the Sherman Antitrust Act, these individuals can be sued for triple damages of an individual who is not allowed to practice. So that'll be very interesting to see what happens as a result of what are the law and economics of occupational licensing. Certainly the laws largely determine what these barriers are, and the higher the barriers, the greater the returns to people in the occupation, but also the harder it is for minorities, ex-offenders, people in the military to get into these occupations. So as I mentioned earlier, there's some very dramatic negative employment consequences of these occupations being licensed, and especially heavily licensed.
I'll include spouses of military as well as a category, and that fits that category. Dr. Kleiner, I want to push back briefly on your comment that the definition of a license is that people are getting paid for it. In the state of Arizona, one of the things that pushed the law that Governor Ducey recently signed is the fact that a person in Arizona was offering free haircuts to the homeless, and the cosmetology board tried to fine him for not being licensed. Any comments?
Well, I think that's been a couple of cases. It may have gone against what the board ruled, that is, even though they were providing those services for free, if you are a barber, you have to follow the rules of the professional association. A similar case came up with dentists, and dentists were providing free dental services. And this was also another Federal Trade Commission case. We're providing free dental services for at-risk kids, as low-income kids, because they were a member of the board, and the board had certain requirements that even though they were providing these services, they were not allowed to provide these services. So if you're part of the club, you have to abide by the rules of the club, including, in some cases, reducing innovation. So an electrician may find a better way to do wiring, but they have to do it in a specific way that's set up by the electrician's board.
Thank you. Next question is about Professor Kleiner, your comments about the cost of occupational licensing. Is that a cost to the economy, or is that just a transfer of wealth between consumers and producers?
Yeah, that's the deadweight loss, which is, as economists, just to individuals in the audience who may not use the jargon of economics, that's lost output. Because wages are higher, employment's lower. That's just output that consumers can't take advantage of because of these barriers to entry and all these other frictions that exist in the labor market due to occupational licensing.
Another question, we still have a minute or two, and I think this one is a good one. And it goes back to the reason, the justification for licensing. And I'll just read the question the way it was asked. It may be the case that cutting hair is the same in South Dakota as it is in Hawaii, but designing buildings in hurricane-prone Florida is very different than designing buildings in earthquake-prone California, or in the snow and frigid temperatures of Minnesota or Western New York State. Do those kinds of differences lead some places to have more and to be justifiable in requiring more, for professional architects or other people, the building trades, etc., the requirements made?
Now, let me give you an example. My son-in-law works for a company called Boeing, and they employ thousands of engineers. Very few of them are licensed, yet they, for the most part, are able to build airplanes that don't fall out of the sky, even though they are unlicensed individuals. So the next time, if and when we can fly again, that these are unlicensed individuals that a company like Boeing certifies the product. And similarly with buildings, it's not who made the building, it's does the building meet certain specifications. Similarly with commercial aircraft, it's not who was doing the wiring or the designing of the plane was done by someone who had a government issued license. It's the company standing behind those planes, or it is the construction company standing behind those buildings, saying those buildings meet certain inspections. Just like going to a restaurant. If you go to a restaurant, the cook probably is not licensed, but certainly the restaurant is inspected in terms of the health and safety of that establishment.
Well, thank you both very much for your sobering discussion of occupational licensing. We appreciate the time you took, Professor Kleiner, to visit us via Zoom.
I was hoping to visit you in January in person, but that's not going to work out.
Maybe we can arrange that at some later time. But we look forward to hearing more at another time, and perhaps a January date, about any progress we are able to make with the reforms after COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to thank Mason Hunt, who's the project coordinator for the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, who kept this webinar running smoothly and handled all the questions. His planning makes this a success. Please join us in 2 weeks' time on October 8th, when the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty releases the Doing Business North America report. As I mentioned earlier, the DBNA report provides objective measures of the ease of doing business across the states, provinces, and federal districts of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, 130 cities across those states, provinces, and federal districts. Over 12,000 data points are collected across 111 variables to create 28 data indicators spread over 6 categories. To score and rank cities in regard to how easy it is to set up, operate, and shut down a business. Perhaps the report one day will include a measure of occupational licensing in each of the cities included. Steve Slavinsky will be joining me again on October 8th, as well as Dean Stansel of Southern Methodist University. Dean is the primary author of the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of North America report. Steve and Dean will discuss the connections between economic freedom and the ease of doing business in cities across North America. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again.